Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Delighted to be here today. But before I commence my session, it's going to be a 2-hour session, so I'm going to be trying my best to make sure that everybody's awake on a Sunday morning in London. But before we proceed, let me just take a moment to honor Sheikh Abdullah Kamil, the founder of AlBaraka, and also appreciation to His Excellency Yusuf Hassan Kalawi for the support, and His Excellency Najmuddin Bilal for a very brilliant insight of what's happening in the world that is supposed to be filled with sustainability, and the world that is supposed to be filled with all these talks about ESG, and the world that is supposed to be filled with the discussions about making it a lot more greener, and the world that is supposed to be filled with the talks about, especially coming from the developed markets, about making sure that the world is filled with companies which are socially responsible. And so when one talks about that, and at the same time, every second we hear about the killings in Gaza, the killings in Lebanon, and I find that there's a disconnect. So with that, so I'm moving away from that topic, right, into something a lot more related to what I'm doing. So I've been doing this for the last 20-odd years. So thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm not that old, by the way. I mean, 30 years is it's a bit too long for me to be doing banking. But delighted to be here once again. I have a lot to cover. Let me start with, this is where I control the slides, right? This is the one? Okay. The green one, okay. Everything is green these days, right? Is it good? Let's see. There you go. I wanted to ask a question about what is sukuk, but so I bit this thing to it, right? Any takers on okay, so this is the one, right? Okay. So any volunteers on what is sukuk? Sukuk has been the buzzword, right? I mean, obviously, His Excellency mentioned about sukuk as well, and I was lucky enough to be involved in both the Hazin sukuk when I was in a bank in Malaysia back in 2014 and 2015 rather, for Hazin. So anyone? Any takers? Just to get everybody warm up, right? About sukuk, because sukuk has been the sexiest product in Islamic finance. I mean, in the Sharia compliant manner. So, yes.
Liquid assets for the future, so it's like an investment into a portfolio of businesses.
That's good. That's a good attempt. Perhaps I should ask someone else. Thank you, sister, for that.
It is an Islamic bond.
Perfect. It is an Islamic bond indeed. So sukuk, plural for sak. So sak means certificates. So sukuk are certificates that basically denote ownership in certain Sharia compliant assets which are income generating. So these assets can be physical assets, such as this building, but not this hotel though. Because this hotel is certainly not Sharia compliant. Though I have done Islamic REITs on non-Sharia compliant hotels before, but the assets have to be Sharia compliant, and the assets can be physical assets, it can be non-physical assets, such as rights to certain income-generating assets, and the assets can be business ventures, and the assets can be shares even, but those shares have to be Sharia-compliant shares. And more than 99% of the sukuk that are issued in the world since 1990, the first sukuk was issued in 1990 by a company called Shell. There's a company called Shell. Everyone knows of Shell, right? And so this particular company, which is a subsidiary of an oil giant called Shell, issued a small sukuk in Malaysia. So that was in 1990. And 24 years later, 34 years later, rather, we have seen, right, a lot of sukuk issued in the market, right? But more than 99% of the sukuk issued in the market are asset-based sukuk, as opposed to them being asset-backed sukuk. Yes, someone's awake. So this discussion about asset-based versus asset-backed, right? It's not a discussion between Arsenal versus Liverpool today, right? Right, and so that discussion is relevant for sukuk, right, compared to it being relevant to a bond, because when one talks about sukuk, it has to be asset related. Yet sukuk are 99% asset based. They're not asset backed. They're not ABS. They're not RMBS, right? They're not CBOs. They're not CDOs, right? And so what it means is 99% of the sukuk that we have seen in the market basically represent the full credit and faith of the obligors, right? Instead of it being a full faith and credit of the assets themselves, right? And so let me just move on to the next slide, because I can't see the slide. Okay. So the next slide basically talks about how the sukuk market has been growing by leaps and bounds over the last 2 decades, right? And how it has now reached 2 trillion, a data that also include government sukuk issuances. So there are several factors that are driving the growth of the sukuk market, particularly in Malaysia and in the GCC. So the more benign rate environment in the near to medium term is expected to boost the growth in the sukuk market further. But despite all that, it is not all good news, right? If you look at the chart, right, on the right-hand side of the slide, if you can refer to that chart, right, sukuk market only accounts for about, how many percent? About 35%. So 30 to 35% of the total fixed income market issued in key Islamic finance markets. And that excludes the UK, for example, right? So we are talking about Malaysia, plus Indonesia, plus the GCC, right? And yet, it's only about 35%. So this is where the problem is. Going back to our sister's response, right, to what sukuk is, right? So this is where the problem is. Despite the fact that we have 25% of the world's population are Muslims, yet only about 35% of the total fixed income issued in the key Islamic finance markets are Islamic bonds, as you call it. So, what are the challenges, right? So what are the challenges in Islamic liquidity management, or sukuk market as a whole? Right? You can see the articles from Fitch, you can see the articles from Islamic Finance News, and so on and so forth, right? It's a glaring issue where Islamic liquidity management is concerned. And so I spoke about this limited number of sukuk that are out there. So just take the UK sukuk market as an example. So I worked on the UK government sukuk, right, in 2014 and in 2019. Sorry, 2021, the second sukuk. By the way, do you know how the UK sukuk works? Has everyone seen the prospectus for the UK government sukuk? You want me to explain about the sukuk? Sure. Okay, can I just take that? So we'll just take about 2 minutes, right? Yeah. 2 3 minutes, yeah. Okay. Thank you, brother. Thank you so much. Thank you. So let's just take example of so I mentioned about the asset-based sukuk, right? So in a typical ijara sukuk, which is a lease sukuk, right? So we have a company A. Let's just call this company a company A, right? And then we have a trustee or an SPV or an SPC, right? Issuing sukuk in exchange for the proceeds, right? Investors. So these proceeds are going to be used to purchase a building, right? Worth, say, $1 billion, right? This is $1 billion worth of building from company A. So the company A will be selling that building for $1 billion, right? So the next minute, the trustee will then lease this asset back to the company for a rental amount, which is equivalent to the profit payment of, say, $Y, right, for the next 5 years. 3, 4, 5. Okay. So this rental amount is basically the coupon amount, right? So this is a typical ijara sukuk, the most favorite sukuk structure before 2011. Right? I mean, it's still my personal favorite, but now this ijara has been changed to another structure called wakala. But before we get to wakala, let's talk about the UK government sukuk. UK government sukuk is a very interesting sukuk. So the first time we did it was 200 million pounds sterling back in 2012, right? And so in that transaction, the Department of what's the name of the department again? Department of Community and for DCLG, right? If I recall, DCL, was it? Department of Community for Land and Community or something like that, right? It was a landlord, DC.
Local government.
DC.
Communities and local government.
Thank you very much. DCLG, right?
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So DCLG was a landlord. And so DCLG, we have an SPV here. So we have an investor, right? So in this case, the SPV issued a 200 million GBP sukuk in exchange for the 200 million proceeds, right, from the investors. SPV will then use this to purchase a 99-year lease, right, from DCLG. So it's a 99-year lease, right? So this is what we call head lease, sublease. So the SPV basically purchased a head lease right from DCLG. So DCLG will then hand over these assets based on this 99-year lease. So upon purchasing this asset, the SPV will then what we call sublease this asset back to DCLG. So DCLG became a sub-lessee. So this SPV was the head lessor And this guy, DCLG, became sub-lessee. So for being a sub-lessee, DCLG had to pay a sub-lease rental, which is equivalent to, GBP Y million over the next 5 years. So this was a 2014-2019 transaction, right? So that was the Sukuk deal. And at maturity in 2019, the unexpired lease term will be sold back by the SPV to DCLG. So for the next 94 years, right? It's 99 minus 5, right? So far so good? So 94 years will be sold back to DCLG for the nominal value of the Sukuk, which was 200 million. So that was UK government Sukuk.
What were the assets?
Government buildings.
Just government
Yeah.
buildings.
So hence why we had DCLG. DCLG, that's right, yeah. And so I can talk about more Sukuk structures, like in the case of government of Malaysia, or government of Indonesia, right, which was the most prolific green Sukuk issuer in the market, right? The most prolific, right? Since we have a lot of Indonesian friends here, so might as well talk about government of Indonesia Sukuk, right? So government of Indonesia, there are only 3 boxes here. In this case, SPV, investors, and the government, which is ROI, Republic of Indonesia, did what we call an istisna ijara sukuk, right? Where the SPV again issued, say, sukuk for $1 billion, right? And this money is then passed on to the Republic of Indonesia, MOF, Ministry of Finance, $1 billion, right? And so how different is this structure compared to the previous 2 structures is that ROI, Republic of Indonesia, did a green sukuk, which was probably one of the most interesting sukuk structures that we've seen ever, where a portion of this was for lease assets sold to the SPV. This is the same lease assets that we saw in the case of UK government, except that this was not a 99-year lease. So as opposed to this being a head lease, sub-lease, this was a pure lease. So government of Indonesia basically sold assets, right? These are assets across Indonesia to SPV. And at the same time, this represents 51% and 49% of the proceeds, which is 490 million and 510 million is for Ijara assets. The remaining 490 was used for what we call construction assets. These are green construction assets across Indonesia. I think we heard from the previous speaker yesterday, right? A speaker mentioned about some of the projects that benefited from this green sukuk that was issued by the government of Indonesia. For example, railway tracks, a renewable solar power, right, in Indonesia, for example. So these were the real projects that the government of Indonesia used, right, for its green sukuk, which was the most prolific green sukuk issuer in the market. Any questions on the sukuk structures? Yes, sir.
UK one, when the 94-year lease that was surrendered back to the DCLG, is that because of the outset of the agreement you agreed that you send it back to
No, it's based on willing buyer, willing seller. Yes, sir.
Why is it always 5 years? Why can't it be longer?
Yeah. I mean, in the case of government Indonesia, they've done a 30-year sukuk. So I've just taken a 5-year term as an example. So we've done 20 years, 30 years. We've done perpetual sukuk as well, without any maturities. So this has been done globally, not only in Malaysia or Indonesia or in the GCC. And the reason why the sukuk market has been thriving is because, just go back to the previous slide, if I could. Can I go back to the previous slide? I can't, right? Oh. Yeah. Anyway, just as I was explaining about the sukuk market, right? In the reason why the sukuk market has been thriving is because in the Islamic finance world, whether it's Malaysia, Indonesia, the GCC, there are a lot of infrastructure projects that are coming on stream, right? If you've been to Malaysia, for example, anyone has been to Malaysia? Yes. Apart from the Malaysians? Right? So, if you look at Malaysia, right, I mean, so this is the, well, not a good robber, right? So this is the West Malaysia, right? This is Thailand. And this is Singapore, right? So we have this massive, what we call North-South Highway, right? Which is about 880 kilometer. So this was funded entirely by Sukuk, right? This is what? Close to about 11 billion US dollar, funded entirely by Sukuk, right? And then we had all these projects in Indonesia, for example, that are coming on stream, which are also funded by Sukuk issuance. But having said that, it is still about what, 35% of the market, right? Which is a problem, right? So if I can go back to the previous slide, which I'm trying my best to get to, can I?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Do we have on the market
Sorry, sir?
beverage sukuk? Is it available?
Beverage.
Beverage one.
Perpetual, yes, we do. We do have perpetual, as I was saying to our brother. Can I go back to the previous slide?
Yes, the red one.
Which one? This one?
Yes.
Yeah, this is the one, okay. So the low level, right? The limited number of sukuk issuance globally. So going back to the UK sukuk, right? The reason why I brought up UK sukuk, in the world now, how many countries are there in the world? Just for the sake of 204, right? It's about 200. So how many countries are rated AAA in the eyes of S&P, Fitch, and Moody's? For those who basically track this on a frequent basis, right? I don't, but probably what, 10, 15? UK is AA, right? UK is AA, and so how many countries are rated AA within that AA band? AA minus, AA flat, and AA plus. Right? UK is one, and then we have a few more. And the last, my last count was 14. And how many countries of that 14, right, AA rated sovereigns or credits are in the Islamic finance world? It's a tougher question, right? Because Malaysia is A minus. So there's only what? Qatar and Abu Dhabi. Qatar and Abu Dhabi. And is Abu Dhabi a country? It's an emirate. Yes, it's only Qatar, right? So if I were an investor, right, in the UK government sukuk, and I invested, say, 50 million, if I were to dispose my sukuk today, right, what would be my alternatives in the AA rated band in the Islamic finance world, assuming I'm an Islamic investor? Qatar doesn't issue sukuk that frequently, right? UAE government doesn't issue sukuk that frequently. So I only have the Singapore government, which is a AAA credit. I have the Estonian government. I have the Czech Republic government. I have the Belgium government. But do these governments issue sukuk? Have you seen the Belgian government issuing sukuk? Or the Hungarian government? Or the Danish government? Or the Swedish government? These are all the AAA rated governments, right? They don't. So buy and hold. So investors, in the sukuk market, investors tend to buy the sukuk, right? From the day they buy the sukuk until the sukuk matures. That's the problem, because there are no other alternatives in the sukuk space. Compared to the conventional bond space where people are so pampered, right? Right? In the conventional space, people are so pampered with options, right? And so that's the problem, right?
So I didn't get it. So why can't it be so?
'Cause That's a good question, brother. I mean, investors can buy the sukuk, but who is selling?
The ones who want to get out, no?
They want to get out, and then if they are looking for a double A rated, the same.
What does it matter to them? I mean, they need the money to get out, right?
If they are looking at getting out, right? But to most of these guys, to some of these guys, sometimes they want to be able to get out from a double A into another double A, right? They do not want to be getting out from a double A to, say, a triple A or a single A, right? They do that as well, but the options are limited. The point is the options are a lot more limited in Islamic finance, in the sukuk space, compared to the more matured conventional space. So yeah, this is where we come to IILM, right, where we have all these LCR requirements and the high quality liquid asset requirements. But before I go to the more technical side, are there any questions? I want to make sure that everybody is able to
Question, why wouldn't there be corporate issued sukuk in the Muslim countries? I mean, I understand the AAA and AA rate.
Good question, brother. I mean, in Malaysia, when we first started doing sukuk, the government realized that they had to provide a lot of incentives for issuers, corporates, to issue sukuk. So they were throwing in incentives after incentives. But before we got to the incentives, they have to make sure that we achieve that level playing field. Hence, the legal framework, for example, was addressed, right? It was they came up with that guidelines on the sukuk issuance. The tax impact was also addressed for sukuk. For example, right, just going back to the structure that I was just describing earlier. In the normal world, right, when you sell an asset, when you sell a building, right, you'll be subjected to, right? So there's just one leg of it, right? There's just one leg of it. What about the rental that you got to pay? So there are a lot of tax related impacts, right, to this. So what the UK government did was, which was very good, right? They make sure that there is no tax liabilities, right? If you were to do sukuk in the UK, for example, similar to what we've been doing in Malaysia, similar to what the GCC markets. Obviously, GCC markets are tax-free, right? Sovereigns, right, or jurisdictions, so they have no issue with this. So this is the problem, right, that we've been facing, especially in the Islamic finance war. So more so in the non-Islamic finance war, especially trying to do sukuk. I mean, imagine trying to do sukuk in Denmark, for example, or in Sweden, when we have all these Arabic structures, right? Whether it's ijara or wakala or istisna or mudaraba or musharaka, right? And with all the tax implications or potential tax implications, right? By throwing in all these structures, right? Which is why in Malaysia, for example, we have evolved into something that is away from this, right? I mean, perpetual sukuk, for example, we are now using shares, Sharia compliant shares as the underlying assets, right? To back the issuance of sukuk, right? And so with that, any other questions before I? Yes.
The policyholder funds or the subscribers funds or participant funds.
Yeah.
Depends on what they call it, Islamic finance. And usually the participant funds in deficit, especially with the comparing to its peers in Malaysia. So my question is, can we cover that deficit by issuing sukuk? This is like a way of enhancing the Islamic finance and make it grow. Is that kind of debt could be dealt with as issuing some sukuks?
Yeah, of course we can. In fact, in Malaysia, a lot of investors are takaful players.
Well, I'm not talking about the investors themselves, the characteristic of the investors. I'm talking that such transaction, we got a deficit in the policyholder funds or the subscribers fund. We are in debt now. So can we cover that debt by issuing sukuk?
No, we can't.
Oh, okay.
We can't.
Is it like legal?
No, you can't because
barriers or,
because investors, they would want to make sure that there's a full recourse,
Okay.
right? So investors wouldn't want to take risks,
Okay.
right? I mean, investors do not want to be liable, right, when it comes to salvaging that gaps, right, on your behalf when they are, and a lot of these investors, unlike the other asset classes, a lot of sukuk or bond investors are sophisticated investors.
Oh, okay.
And they're managing third-party investors' money, right? So they're liable for it as fund managers, right? As pension funds, for example,
Yeah.
as sovereign wealth funds, right? So they need to make sure, even as insurance companies, right? Insurance companies wouldn't want to invest in that themselves, right?
Yeah.
Just to plug the gaps because they are managing the policyholders' money, right? So that brings me to the definition of high quality liquid asset, where we have level 1, level 2A and 2B, and specific to ILM, because of the limitations in Islamic finance, the Islamic Financial Services Board, which is also based in Kuala Lumpur, has recommended its members to grant a level 1 and 0% risk weight treatment to the ILM. So at the moment, we are between level 1 and level 2, right, which is comparable to Islamic Development Bank long-term sukuk. It's a long-term sukuk, yeah? And some of the short-term sukuk issued by various central banks all over the world, right, which are also treated as level 1, right? But unlike these two options, ILM short-term sukuk is done or is issued rather on a monthly basis. So if you look at, I will skip this part. I'll just go straight to this part and I'll come back to the we do our sukuk on a monthly basis, right? And so our sukuk basically ranges between 800 to about 1.3 billion dollar on a monthly basis. So that is the difference between our sukuk and some of the sukuk that you can see from Islamic Development Bank and central bank sukuk. So what were there before ILM, pre-ILM, right? So for the Islamic banks, when it comes to managing their liquidities, right, they had this long-term sukuk issued by, for example, IDB, commodity murabaha placement, where they were placing money with the other banks or with the central banks for small returns or 0% returns, and they are subjected to counterparty credit risk, as well as the fact that some of these structures are not fully compliant in the eyes of Sharia, and some of them just keeping cash for 0% return. So, I mean, just going back to this, right? How do you make sure that Islamic banks can remain competitive compared to the conventional banks when it comes to managing their liquidities, they are restricted, right? Their options are limited compared to the conventional banks. So, yeah, so ILM, we are owned by 8 central banks and ICD. And so before ILM, as you know, the cross-border liquidity Islamic management offering was underdeveloped. And now, because we run what we call an asset-backed commercial paper issuance program, up to 1 year tenor, so we issue sukuk on a monthly basis. So our sukuk are rated A1, F1, probably the only ones in the world, rated A1, F1, done on a monthly basis. And we are backed by high-quality underlying asset pool. So how does ILM do its thing, right? When it comes to, if you look at the structure of ILM, at both ends of the spectrums, we have sukuk issuances, right? At the short-term issuance, what ILM does, ILM will issue sukuk to the investors on a monthly basis, and the proceeds from the short-term sukuk is being used by ILM to fund what we call asset obligors for a period of up to 15 years. And so that's how we we run the entire program on a monthly basis, and we've been doing this since 2013. So our operations, so these are the requirements. Our program size is 4 billion at the moment, outstanding, out of 6 billion. So we issue sukuk from 1 month to 12 months tenors. So we have 11 primary dealers at the moment. Our sukuk are issued at par. So when it comes to long-term asset criteria, right, one of the most, rather the most important criterion is our asset obligors have to be that of sovereigns or GREs, government-related entities, as well as supra, rated A flat by both S&P and Fitch, right? So that, if you were to extrapolate that A flat on a long-term basis, it will come to A1, F1 on a short-term basis, right? And so from the Sharia side, our tangibility ratio now stood at 76%. So we've been doing this, we've done about 112 billion since day one, since August 2013 up to last month. And in terms of the, wow, okay, so this is not coming out. So our PDs are all over the world. We do have 11 PDs at the moment. We will be welcoming our 12th PD next week, inshallah, from Oman. The first PD from Oman. And so our intention is to be able to open up our sukuk to as many Islamic banks, right? Like for example, now KFH is the second largest Islamic bank in the world. FAB is the largest banking group in UAE. Dohan is one of the strongest banks in Qatar. Maybank and CIMB are basically top 2 banks in Malaysia. Stanchart, obviously, we know Stanchart. And AlBaraka is one of the most prolific Islamic banks in Turkey. So Bubian is a subsidiary of MBK, which is a flagship bank in Kuwait, and so on and so forth. So yeah, premier outlet, that's a very interesting choice of words for ILM. So if you look at ILM Sukuk, right, and we have actually weathered through the thick and thin of, when it comes to, there's just so many crises that have happened, right, in the last, 10 years. But in our case, if you look at from February 16, we have so many rate cuts by Feds, for example, and we had pandemic, right, in 2020, 22, 21. And despite that, our BTC, our coverage ratio has been hovering at comfortably at about two times, about 200%. So just going back to these PDs. So what does a PD do? Each of the PDs here, they will have to indicate a minimum commitment. So when they become a PD with ILM, right, they have to indicate a minimum commitment of X%. So for every auction on a monthly basis, say for example, a PD here will have a 10% minimum commitment, right? Just take a 10% without naming that PD. So for every auction, assuming we're doing an auction of $1 billion, that PD would have to bid a minimum of 100 million.
As underwriter.
Underwriter. Yes, sir.
Did I understand correctly, you issue your sukuk for 1 year at par?
Yes.
That's not going to encourage much investment. Return is the return you yield, whatever you get.
So our sukuk is done on a floating rate basis, sir. Right? So we do 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and up to 1 year. So 1 year is done on a case-to-case basis for ILM. So there's always an ability for us to make spreads. So just going back to your question, right? So I'm sharing some trade secrets now. So I have to. So for example, right, on the short-term basis, right, ILM. So this is short-term sukuk. So this is long-term sukuk. So up to 15 years, right? So this is up to 12 months. So investors, yeah? ILM. So ILM issues sukuk, right, on a floating rate basis, right? So this can be a 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, up to 12 months. So we do sukuk, so it can be a 5-year sukuk, it can be a 10-year sukuk, it can be a 15-year sukuk. So there's enough spread between our funding, right, and this, right? Because in this case, right, the investors here will, this case the obligor. So the obligor issues sukuk to ILM, right? ILM will then pass the money from this, right? So we will issue a 5-year sukuk backed by our short-term sukuk. So obviously there is a difference in terms of the pricing, even for 1 year, right? Compared to our longer-term sukuk, where ILM is the single sukuk holder or investor. So just to reaffirm that point, we look at the BTC, which is a problem for Islamic finance. It is a good problem for ILM, but there's a glaring problem for Islamic finance. That means that Islamic banks are flush with liquidities. So the demand.
All the issues just government issuance?
Yeah. Sovereigns, GREs. So I cannot even onboard corporates, though the corporates are rated AA, for example, even AAA. But they are corporates, I cannot even onboard them.
Why not?
They can't because of the supra status of ILM. So we need to make sure that, of course, but we're not looking at yield. We're not looking at yield or the rating. We are looking at the supra status and the fact that our papers are level 1, 2A, right, in terms of the HQLA treatment. So we look at the definition of HQLA just now, right? Yeah. Zero haircut for MDBs. I'm actually quite disappointed that I won't be able to show these 2 slides, but yeah, that's fine. So even during crisis, at the height of the pandemic in 2020, if you look at the issued amount versus the order book, right? Even for the 6 months, right? And we did not do 12 months, just 6 months maximum. The order books are way above the issued amount.
That happened in the bond market as well.
Sorry?
That happened in the bond market.
Yes,
as well.
of course. But for Islamic finance, it's a lot more apparent, right? Even during the crisis, right? During the COVID, for example, right? When we were having problems, for example, when the market was having problems when it comes to the yields, right? Because during the crisis, as you know, the yield spiked up.
I think more importantly is what happened after 2022.
Yeah.
Did when interest rates went up. And that's more interesting.
So in 2022, for example, right, if you look at the secondary trading for our papers, right, it started basically increasing from 2022, from July 2022 up to now. So 23 was our best year. 2024, which is a problem now for Islamic finance, where the demand exceeds supply. So if you look at the demand for 2024 year to date, our secondary trades now, it's at 1.93 billion versus, so it's down 12% versus 2.2, right, for the same period last year. So that shows that investors are now buying it and they're just keeping it. So what's next for ILM? So yeah, for ILM, before that, any more questions? Oh yes, yeah.
Hi, just wondering what your fees are like.
And I'm really going into the trade secrets. No, we don't charge any fees. So why are people coming to ILM then? That we don't charge any fees. Do you want to answer that question, Mr. Majid? What is the one thing that excites a financial controller or treasurer or CAO or company or British Telecom, for example?
Nothing
Or
at all.
sorry?
Nothing at all.
What is the most important criterion for anyone looking at tapping the sukuk or the bond market? No, for the issuer, not for the investor, for the pricing, right? The profit, right? The pricing, right? It's the pricing. Right? Pricing is the most important criterion. Of course, for the likes of Republic of Indonesia, Government of Malaysia, UK government has got its own agenda, right? For doing sukuk on a couple of occasions, right? As some of you may know, right? Because UK wants to become a global center in Islamic finance, right? Yet, I remember when we were discussing with HMT, the criteria was very clear. You have to make sure that the pricing is as good as the pricing for the conventional bonds, if not cheaper. It has to be cheaper. It should not be the same. So the phenomenon that we saw in Malaysia, right? If you were to do a sukuk versus you doing a conventional bonds in Malaysia, or even in the global space now, the pricing for the sukuk will be cheaper because of the wider investor base, right? We are fully mindful of that, right? And that's something that we have seen, the phenomenon that we've seen for the last about 10 years now.
And what
So-
about the investor? Investor is looking for higher.
Yes, they are, but they are also looking at secondary trading, sir. So if you were to invest in sukuk, for example, the ability of you churning out, right, it's a lot higher than you buying into a conventional bonds because of the much bigger investor base. Something that we saw in the case of an issuer that issue sukuk and bonds at the same time. The demand for the sukuk will be what? 4, 5, 6, 7 times versus the demand for the bonds, which will be what? 2, 3, 4 times. There's a lot bigger investor base for sukuk versus bonds, right? And same thing, right? I mean, I like to use an analogy where you go to a cafe that has got that halal signage, clear halal signage, right? And you will see both Muslims and non-Muslims having their meals together, versus you going to a cafe that has got no halal signage, right? You only see the non-Muslims, right, having their meals, right? So so for sukuk, because of the Sharia certification that was given to you by the Sharia boards, right? You will see a lot of the Islamic accounts coming in because of the clear explicit mandates that were given to them. So back to the question, right? For ILM, for the likes of all these prolific issuers, they can go to the public market and issue sukuk on their own, right? But for ILM, because we are the sole investor, and we can do $1 billion within 2 months, there is no need for the issuer to do a roadshow. There's no need for the issuer to do a listing. There's no need for the issuer to do a filing, right? There's no need for them to do any of that. They can just come to ILM, right? We will tell them that if you like the credit, for example, right, if they are rated A and above, for example, if they have that government ownership in them, for example, and then we will look at the credit, we will assess the credit, and then we will just onboard them, right, for up to 15 years. So now comes the pricing. So how do you price a deal for example, UK government, right? So when we look at the UK government, there is a sukuk for UK government which is maturing in, I think, 2026, right? The second sukuk that they did 3 years ago, I think it was a 500 million, right? Was it 500 million pound sterling? So I can't recall now. It was a 500 million ijara sukuk, right? Was it? Yes. 500, right? So when we look at the secondary curve, right, on the Bloomberg, for the UK government sukuk, right? For example, if they are trading at a certain level, we will be pricing them to be able to entice them to come to ILM at X minus Y bips or percent. So there is a discount for them to come to ILM. So that is enough an incentive, right, for anyone to come to ILM because pricing will be cheaper. There's no need for them to go all over the world to sell the sukuk, right? To go to Singapore, Hong Kong, to the GCC, right? To market your sukuk, right? And there's no need for you to get your sukuk listed on any of the exchanges, right? So everything is a lot more simpler by coming to us than you going to doing a public sukuk. There are other considerations because I came from the other side, right? When I was doing sukuk, right, on behalf of the banks, of the investment banks. So why wouldn't people come to ILM? For example, right, a lot of the investors, especially, yes, sir.
Is it only for government issuances, or I mean, I'm talking about
No, we do not do corporates. That's what we were discussing earlier, right? And yeah.
I think the biggest challenge would be regulation. It's not just pricing.
But having said that, if you look at, let's just take, I mean, UK government may not be the right example. Is there any other credits that come to your mind? Mubadala. This is actually a fresh from the oven, right? Mubadala just did a sukuk recently. Everyone knows Mubadala, right? Mubadala is a sovereign wealth fund of Abu Dhabi. Right? They did a sukuk recently, a wakala sukuk based on shares. Right? So Mubadala is a perfect candidate for ILM for the reasons that we discussed earlier, right? It's a sovereign link entity. It's owned by Abu Dhabi, for example. So it fits the bill, 101%. So Mubadala has got two options, right? If they need to raise some money for whatever reason, whether OPEX, CAPEX, they want to refinance their existing borrowings, right? They then look at public sukuk, public bonds, right? They can do both sukuk and bonds. Or if they're looking at a private sukuk, they can come to ILM. And of the three, I can confirm today that our pricing will be the cheapest compared to public sukuk or public bond issuances. Yes, sir.
Assalamualaikum. First of all, excellent presentation. I think you have covered quite a few got involved in Islamic finance, I think almost 27 years ago. All I've been hearing is lots of problems, the challenges and all that. Now, looking at board structure, IRLM, today you're dealing only with the governments. Look at the structure of Islamic Development Bank. Now, the Islamic Development Bank has another department, ICD, that deals with the corporates. I think when we come out and present all that to the general public, solutions rather than just the problems and the challenges.
Thank you so much for that insight. So I think just to your first point, so what we're trying to do now, just to your first point, we are looking at expanding the sukuk beyond the 12 months, and we are also looking at bringing down the rating curve. Right, at the moment it's A flat, right, and so we are looking at bringing down the rating curve to as low as BBB to cater for credits which are not within that A flat or at that A flat rating criterion. So when it comes to the the possibility of bringing corporates. So going back to, I think, brother's question as well. I think at the moment it's still at the, because that's actually our mandate. Our mandate is basically to look at sovereigns and sovereign linked assets. And because our role, brother, is not about getting the corporates to issue the sukuk. Our role is to make sure that Islamic banks have outlets to place their excess funds, right, at any given point in transit. Right? That's another way of looking at it, right? So we want to make sure that Islamic banks, whether you are from UK or from Pakistan, for example, right, if you have excess funds in dollars for now, right, you have the ability to place money with ILM for a very decent return, and that investment that you're putting in would allow you, right, it is not a murabaha or wakala placement, for example, right, which are non-tradable. So you can actually invest in our sukuk, right, and you can actually trade that sukuk at any given point of time, right? So that's the beauty, right? So our papers are somewhat liquid now. It's getting a lot more liquid now. It's about 2 billion this year alone. Our papers are obviously Sharia compliant in the eyes of some of the most strictest Sharia scholars. I mean, our papers are, we are probably the only source of reliable and dependable issuer of short-term sukuk in the world. And yet, we are now looking at extending that to beyond the 12-month tenor. So what would that mean? That would mean that we'll be competing with the likes of ISDB, sukuk. We'll be competing with the likes of some of the other SOEs or GRE issuances, right? Because they will be doing a 5-year sukuk. They'll be doing a 3-year sukuk, for example. So we'll be in direct competition with them. So there's something that we're assessing. We are also assessing issuing in other reserve currencies apart from US dollar. Because there have been 1 or 2 reverse inquiries coming to us in terms of issuing in pound sterling. Right, for us to issue in Singapore dollars, for example. So those are the considerations. And yeah, in terms of investor base, right, as I was saying earlier, ILM, the issue is more on the asset side. Because at the moment, demand clearly exceeds supply. Right, we do 1 billion today, we do 1.5 billion today, our book will be oversubscribed by multiple times. So the issue is not so much on this side, it's on this side. Right, so the challenge is for us to be able to increase the assets, right, which is what we're doing now. We've been ramping up on the asset side, and we are now, to be honest, ILM has been changed as a quasi-treasury house, as a quasi-investment bank. So we are working hand in hand with our PDs now and our friendly investment banks. And so that efforts are bearing fruits. We just onboarded our asset 490 million from Abu Dhabi, 27 August. So we are onboarding another 600 million before the year ends. At the moment, sukuk.
That's a measure of putting. No funds, no sustainable fund with short, medium, and like you have 2 to 5 years as well, which you sublease into. You don't use a
We do, on a monthly basis. So just just going back to our structure. Yeah. So we do this on a monthly basis, right? And our average issuance size is about $1 billion a month, right? And that $1 billion is spread over that 1 month, 3 month, 6 month, 12 month buckets, right? And which is a much bigger problem for Islamic banks now, because they need to be able to find an avenue for them to invest on a short-term basis. In fact, now we are getting an inquiry for us to be doing an overnight. There has been 1 or 2 inquiries for ILM to look at doing overnight. The issue with that, brother, is if you were to do overnight, so every day I have to find investors to subscribe to my sukuk. right? At the moment, right, I will do 1 month. I know that if I do 1 month, I roll over after on a monthly basis, even a $300, $400, $500 million, my book will be oversubscribed. But if I do a $250 million on an overnight basis, right, what is the assurance that my 250 million will be rolled over the next day in dollar, right? So if I were to extend that to pound sterling, right, with the likes of UK banks, for example, what is the assurance that I'll be able to get constant interest from UK-based Islamic banks, for example, right, for GBP, currency, for example. So that's something that we're looking at. So our role is to plug that gap. So we've been able to narrow that gap, right, in the last couple of years. So we will continue to plug the gaps. But as the Islamic banks get a lot bigger, a lot stronger, right, across the globe, right, so we are seeing this phenomenon where demand will continue to outpace supply. So we need to work harder. So how do we work harder, right? So just going back to my last slide. So we need to continue to increase this. So this was recently increased to 6 billion in August. So we are looking at ending this year at above 4 billion. So we are looking at 5 billion by end of next year and 6 billion by end of 2026. So I guess I've come to my last slide, yeah. Are there any questions? I got that right. Any questions, any more questions? Yeah, yes sir.
How open would the IRM to issuance in euros?
Yeah, I think we've actually received 1 or 2 leads from the banks. At the moment, the board is very strict that the obligor has to be government linked, right? So we've received 1 or 2 leads, so we have to actually we have to turn them down for now. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. From an investor perspective, annual return from Sukuk, or the one that you're offering in shares, or
There's a mic for you.
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. But it is. Yeah. So what's the return typically of your Sukuk on an annual basis, and how does that compare to, say, stocks and shares, let's just say, of S&P, or real estate, in the long term, I guess?
Bear with me. Okay. So we look at the HQLA fundamental characteristics, right? I mean, we have to make sure that low risk, right? Low correlation with risky assets, and flight for quality and low volatility. So we have to. So because of that, our return, is not that high, right? But more importantly, we have to qualify for that level 1, level 2A, right? For banks, for example, they cannot simply invest in stocks, right? So our investors are FIs, right? 55% of our investors are banks, Islamic banks. 45% are end investors, and they are asset managers. They can be takaful companies, they can be sovereign wealth funds, they can be central banks, for example, but 55% are still banks. And they invest in our papers because of this HQLA requirements. So they have to make sure that, which is very important for ILM, because of this mandate that was entrusted onto us, right? And they need to be able to manage their liquidity well. But at the same time, we do not want them to we do not want them to not being able to optimize their excess liquidities, right? By not earning anything on the excess liquidities, right? Because of the LCR requirements, right? That came into stream in 2019, right? Any?
Question. Yes, I spent 20 years as a multi-asset manager for leading
Mhm.
of different maturities. And also it's interesting that new column showing that risk-free
Yes, of course.
for the capital requirements.
Yeah, which is why I feel that more and more Islamic banks should be coming to ILM because of 0% risk weight, right? And compared to you investing into other asset classes, for example, right? Like if you were to invest in corporate sukuk, at best you will get 2A. And for 2A, your haircut will be up to 25%, for example. In our case, it's 0% risk weight. So the benefit is actually for the banks to be able to invest in ILM's paper and still receive decent returns and still be able to trade on the papers, right? And so that's the benefit of you coming to ILM. So in terms of comparing ourselves to the other so-called peers, right? I can't find any apple for apple comparison. Maybe apple for pear comparison. And the pair comparisons would be ISDB, Islamic Development Bank. But IDB does not issue short-term sukuk. So the other, I would say, semi-direct competitors would be the short-term sukuk issued by central banks. But the short-term sukuk issued by central banks, for example, Malaysian government, when they issue sukuk, they are A minus, and we are A flat credit, right? So obviously our pricing will be slightly more tighter, right, as you know, compared to the Malaysian government sukuk. Right? And Malaysian government sukuk is issued to local PDs, local dealers, for example, right? And in our case, our dealers are all over the world.
And volatility will be quite low now because of infrequent trading.
Yeah. But at the same time, you need to make sure that they are also classified as 0% risk weight. Right? And because of that, as what I was saying earlier, there are not that many apple for apple comparisons. Right? I can compare to sukuk issued by corporates, for example. Right? Obviously their returns are a lot more. Right? I would say there are a lot more meat to those the papers issued by corporates, for example, compared to our returns, right? But because of the haircut and investors, especially banks, when they invest in our papers, they will invest mainly for the purposes of adhering to the HQLA requirements, for them to be able to adhere to the LCR requirements, essentially.
Default risk will be zero, of course, but you will still look at the inflation risk,
Mm-hmm.
currency risk, and some other factors.
Which is why US dollar is the most plausible currency at the moment for a lot of these banks, right? So that's why we are discussing, we are exploring other currencies as well, right? But US dollar seems to be the most lucrative, the most, I would say, the most popular at this stage. And this applies to banks that have natural requirements for US dollar, where there's no currency risk altogether, right? They're just managing that US dollar as excess funds for them. Any last question before we adjourn? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
If I understand it right, you issue sukuks to AA central banks. How about central banks of Central Asia, whose rating is B minus? Do you issue sukuk for them, and how would the interest of the investors be? For example, Uzbekistan recently this year issued a bond, euro bond, I think, for 400 million. Why would they go to London Stock Exchange or other exchanges, but come to you and make it more halal way?
Halal way. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah, I guess for Uzbekistan, right, it's an Islamic country, right? And I think for all Islamic country, the obvious option, the obvious choice would be for you to do Islamic finance, for you to be doing sukuk, right? In fact, Islamic finance has to be the default proposition, right? And when one talks about this dual banking phenomenon, right, by right, and just going back to what I believe our keynote speaker was saying yesterday, and also our speaker from Bosnia Herzegovina spoke about this ethical finance, and you were comparing it with the likes of Sweden, Denmark, for example, right? So Islamic banks should be the default propositions. So every bank should start as Islamic banks. So conventional banks should be the alternative finance, not the other way around, right? So that's a very important point. So coming back to Uzbekistan, yes, Uzbekistan should come to ILM, right? And for that, you can come to ILM. The only issue is actually on the rating, because you're not rated A and above, right? You are what, double B? Double B now, right, Uzbekistan? So Uzbek can come to ILM, right? We can actually get Uzbek to be guaranteed by a triple A or double A, right? Credit guarantor. It can be in the form of a bank, right, which is owned by the government, right? Or even ISDB or ISEC, for example, as examples, right, of guarantors. But for you to come to ILM on your own, obviously, it's not going to be doable, right? It's going to be impossible. But you can do it, right? Because you are a sovereign. Unlike, I think there was another question, right, posed by our brother there, right? A corporate coming to ILM with a guarantee from a sovereign, right? That was your question, right?
Well, I mean, I'll take it over in a break, but
As a guarantor.
as a guy,
But who is the obligor?
whoever break.
Okay. Thank you so much. Looking forward to that. So yeah, so thank you so much for all the questions. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the sessions. Any other questions, any other structures that you want to know? Right, because we can actually go very detailed into this on the structure side, because this is something that is very close to our hearts, right, as Islamic finance practitioners. And otherwise, thank you so much for listening, and have a good day. Bye.